So almost every wasteland in London that was a place for radical activity has been turned into a garden. And if you look at all the public parks, they're almost all the places, spa fields, other places, they're almost all the places that people rioted, did all sorts of things. So to go back to rioting, let's just start with that. The first thing is, what is a riot? A riot is when three people get really lippy. Now that was the answer to the 1970s. This is Lord Scarman after the Brixton disorders. Can you hear me at back? Sorry, I hope I'm shouting loud enough. This is Lord Scarman after the Brixton disorders. This was just before the law was changed, and I need to upgrade my book, which with luck it will do, because it's possibly coming out in a new edition in the next few months. But this one is the one for the moment. So let me find out. Here. And this was Lord Scarman's attempt at defining it. It is defined in law. Since 1715 there has been, or there was, a Riot Act. And the Riot Act says that if there's three people together who look very bolshy, that's a riot. That is a riot, full stop. And here is Scarman's definition of that. Riot is a tumultuous disturbance of the peace by three or more people. Now, how you do a tumultuous disturbance of the peace when there's only three of you, I suppose, run down the road and chuck stones at things. But anyway, that's what it is. Three or more people, but there's better to come, I think, assembled together with an intent, not an actual doing, with an intent. So if a policeman, since 1715, was to come down the road and say, oi, oi, you look a bit dodgy, you three on the road, you look like you intend to have a riot, that's a riot. That's a riot. And that's why, of course, with the anarchists and all the rest of it, there's so much difficulty in defining this subject. It's the most difficult to define subject in British law. Public disturbance is incredibly problematic. And of course, in truth, the police force, 1829 police force, Metropolitan Police Force, and the other constabularies around England were set up to sort out public order. They weren't set up to catch criminals. And that's why they're no good at catching criminals. I hope there's no policemen in the audience. But that's why they're no good, because they're set up specifically to keep public order, and you can trace this easily through history. Riot is a tumultuous disturbance of the peace by three or more persons assembled together with intent mutually to assist one another by force, if necessary, so they don't have to do it, against anyone who opposes them in the execution of a common purpose, and who execute or begin to execute that purpose in a violent manner, so as to alarm, here's the interesting bit, at least one person. You only have to alarm one person of a reasonable firmness and courage. So if all of you here are just walking down the street and you have reasonable firmness and courage, but you actually get scared by three people standing on the corner saying, oh, I don't like you, then that's a riot. That is the definition, and that was the legal definition until the 1970s. That changed. That changed in 1986, Public Order Act. They decided that a riot was no longer three people starting getting crazy. It was 12 people. Now, I have no idea why they got 12 people. Maybe because three people seemed a bit ridiculous. But they got 12 people. However, a violent affray, which is a riot that means stone throwing, is still three people. And it's still the case that if you disturb someone of a solid moral constitution, then you have caused a public disturbance, a riot. The problem is, of course, how do you deal with them? Well, of course, the person of a reasonably sound disposition in the old days was the magistrate. And the magistrate was the local GP. He was obviously a man of substance, always a man, of course, a man of substance. He would obviously wish to keep the status quo. And so what they would do is, for instance, to skip a couple of thousand years to go into the 1880s, they would simply ride into, in this case, Trafalgar Square, I'll talk about the geography in a minute, and stand there and read the Riot Act. Now, it is said, Ian Bone of Class War told me this, and I actually can't find it, but I think he's right. There was a deaf and dumb riot in Deptford, which they couldn't quell. And they actually had to hold up the signs saying, please stop rioting, because no one could hear him, which is hilarious. I don't know if it's true, it's completely incorrect, but it's amusing. Nevertheless, the magistrate, it always has to be a magistrate, would ride into town on a horse, because it had to be seen, and read out as loud as possible, you must stop rioting. Of course, there's no way to do it, there's not really megaphones or anything in those days. You must stop rioting. If they didn't stop rioting, then the army, it was almost always the army, had the right to shoot you. Two problems with that. The first thing is, if you shoot someone before the Riot Act is read, you are guilty of murder. If you shoot someone after the Riot Act is read, you're still guilty of murder. So you can't really win. So you're in a really serious situation. And indeed, in the Gordon riots and in the Sparfield disturbances and elsewhere, people running down alleys to escape the police with truncheons or the militia with truncheons or staves would run into them. Of course, they're in a corner. There's no cameras in those days. They bash them up and beat them up. And of course, in those days, if you were caught doing that, and remember, no one was on the side. Only the people with property were on the side of the people with the batons. So no one was on their side. So, for instance, a very obvious example: after Gordon riots, the militia was very worried. The soldiers, they were actually proper soldiers in those days, rather the militia came out. They were very worried they would be indicted for murders. Quite serious. So you're better off not doing what you wanted to do. The other thing, of course, is if you're a policeman, and the police started in 1829 in London, if you're a policeman, you were an agent provocateur. You were someone who was starting the trouble, very similar to G20 it seems to me, rather than actually trying to quell the trouble. So the very first policeman to die in a riot was Colbart Field's riot in the 1830s, and he got, I can't remember the exact circumstance, I think he got bashed up, unfortunately he died. He was a policeman. The police were considered corrupt. They caught the people who did it. The people who did it were up against the beak, and the beak said, seems to me what you did was self-defense, bye-bye. Because people were not willing to accept the police until about 1856, 57. It was a very long time. The police force took a long time. And indeed, if you think about the police force still has as its chiefs around England, chief constable. That is the old medieval word, rather than commissioner of police, which is metropolitan police, which comes from French. So the idea that this is a French infiltration, that the police are somehow a nasty organisation that was brought in by the French, or a paramilitary organisation, has always existed. And it seems to me now that with kettling and other things they do, and the batons and all the rest of it, they seem to be getting a bit more, unfortunately, like the military. But of course the point was that doing these things was a very difficult enterprise. So you might say that all the stuff was on the side of the rioters. The other thing to say is that rioting is a very odd activity. I thought when I wrote these two books I'd go on a few riots, simply because you can't write a book unless you actually know what the hell's going on. You can't read Shakespeare or the Tudors, but you can go on a riot and see what goes on. What I noticed was, number one, very few people actually want to riot. Most people just will walk down the street, shout abuse and yell a bit. Their Iraq thing, they threw shoes, didn't they? That's about the level of British rioting. And we're not the Koreans who wear hard hats and batons and all the rest of it. So I went down to a couple of riots. The first riot I went to was the guerrilla gardening riots, if you remember that, in 2000. And first of all, it was immensely peaceful. Second of all, it struck me that almost all riots that I've been to have started with an agent provocateur. Almost always they start with someone who runs into the crowd. In this case, the person who smashed up McDonald's was a great big guy, a rugby player clearly, in a shirt and tie, who the little, I mean, if you know the anti-vivisectionist lot, the little 16-year-olds who put the balaclavas over their head and decided to get lippy. Well, they were running at this plate glass because they couldn't break. I mean, poor kids, they were just sort of breaking themselves. And this huge guy came along and just kicked it in for them. Of course, they ran in. It was set up. It was evidently set up by Special Branch or someone else. So the problem with this, if you look at, for instance, the Countryside Alliance riot, which was a police riot, if you recall the evidence, it was considered a police riot, not a public order offence. In that respect, it almost always starts with someone who is willing to push the button. Very rarely will it start with the ordinary demonstrators.